Appalachia is full of scary, spooky stories about ghosts and haints and unexplained things and supernatural things. From Mothman to Rawhead and Bloody Bones, you'll hear all kinds of tales in Appalachia about things that go bump in the night, things that scare you. I'm going to share with you my favorite ghost story, my favorite one of those kind of scary stories, and it comes from my dear friend Ethelene Dyer Jones. She grew up just over the Georgia line from where I'm at in the Choastoe section of Union County. She wrote this piece for me several years ago, a long time ago, as a guest post on the Blind Pig and the Acorn. Ethelene is a prolific writer, from poetry to lots of things about history. She's a very prolific writer, and you can probably find some of her writings online if you want to. So this is the name of the story that she told, was A Mother's Love Defied the Bonds of Death. This morning is cloudy and dark. The overcast sky puts me in mind of days in the mountains in my childhood when the clouds hung low and fog rose like a giant shroud hiding the majestic peaks that stood like sentinels over Choastoe Valley. Then I thought of the tradition of mountain storytelling and how we were entertained as children by hearing stories that had been passed from generation to generation by our Scots-Irish forebears. My favorite storytellers from my childhood were my first cousin, much older than I, my mother's nephew, Earl Hood, and his wife, Allie Wynne Hood. This delightful couple had no children of their own, but they seemed to be very pleased when Earl's nephew and nieces and his young cousins went to spend the night. With no electricity then in that mountain home, and the only heat being from an open fireplace, we settled down to a wonderful night of entertainment provided by master storytellers Earl and Allie Hood. The recipients of this rich legacy of mountain tales, many of them about ghosts and haints, were little Ed and Bertha Hood Dyer's children, our cousins Wilma, Janelle, Harold, and Sarah Ruth, and my younger brother Bluford Dyer, and I, Ethelene. We all got permission in advance to go to Allie's and Earl's to spend the night on certain Friday nights, and walked the distance from Choastoe Elementary School to their house. It must have been more than 3 miles, but the anticipation of what we would enjoy once we arrived made us skip along, laughing and talking all the while, with the boys, Harold and Bluford, outstripping the girls and arriving first, boasting that they were stronger than we girls. After the evening chores of milking and feeding and getting in the wood were finished, Allie served us a wonderful meal of hot cornbread, vegetable and country cured ham, topped off by a dried apple stack cake. We quickly washed the dishes and then settled down for an evening's entertainment, the likes of which have never been surpassed, even with the advent of television years later. One ghost tale I remember them telling, and they had a way of making us see the scene they laid out before us with their words, was one about a mother's love for her baby. Allie would warn us that we should not try to match the names in the stories to people living or dead. This had happened so long ago it would be hard to remember them exactly, and the story went something like this. Years ago, when sawmillers first came to our mountains to cut down the virgin trees and saw them into lumber, there lived far up near Round Top Mountain a couple named Sexton, Liza and John. They loved each other dearly, and in the course of time, Liza had a beautiful baby girl whom they named after her mother but called her Liza. The midwife or granny woman named Mary had attended little Liza's birth, and things were going along well until 2 days after Liza's birth, her mother came down with a raging fever. Granny woman Mary administered her herbal remedies, but none had any effect on the fever, and Eliza grew worse. John told Granny Mary that he was going to Blairsville, some 14 miles from his home, to get the doctor. He took off down the rutted mountain road, made worse by the snaking out of the saw logs and the rough treatment from big trucks just then coming into the mountains, hauling out the sawed lumber. John finally arrived in town in his buggy drawn by his horse, but the doctor was out on a call delivering a baby and was not expected back until the next day. John decided to stay in town and wait for the doctor, because he would have to take the doctor in his buggy back up to his cabin on Round Top. John didn't get much sleep that night, trying to rest in his buggy. Fortunately, he had brought along a blanket to protect himself from the night's cold. All he could think about was how sick Liza was, and even how still the newborn baby seemed in the large basket that was her crib. About daybreak, the doctor came back from his all-night call, tired and sleepy, but he agreed to go with John to examine Eliza and little Liza. After hot breakfast and coffee, which the good doctor's wife prepared for her husband and for John, the two men got into John's buggy and took off at a lope as John urged the horse to a trot. Finally, they arrived at the John Sexton home. Granny Mary met them on the porch. "I'm afraid you're too late," she said. "Both Eliza and little Liza died during the night." John, gripped with deep grief, went inside the cabin where he saw his beautiful Eliza and the little baby laid out for burying. How could this have happened? If only the doctor had been at home, maybe his wife and child could have been saved. The doctor and granny woman, Mary, tried to console John. Neighbors came and made a casket. They placed the bodies together in the homemade casket, the baby in Eliza's arms. They were buried in the cemetery near the little log church called Salem. John, so devastated, did not want his neighbors' sympathy or their food, which they had always took with love and concern to the household that had experienced death. John latched his cabin door and told his neighbors he would have to bear his burdens of grief alone. The next morning, John's neighbor, James Collins, went to his barn before daylight to milk his cows. Times were hard in those days, and there were always people on the road dropping by farmhouses and barns to beg for food. James realized someone was in the barn with him. He turned and saw a woman dressed in black, the sort of finer dress like the women in the community wore to church. She sat a tin cup down on a bale of hay. James knew she wanted it full of milk, so he took the cup and soon filled it with warm, rich milk. The woman nodded her thanks, but did not say a word. The next morning and the next, the same woman visited James as he was milking, begging with her cup. On the fourth morning, James decided he would follow the woman who would not give him her name. Maybe he could find out where she lived. He saw her dark form disappear into the woods, but running, he was able to follow her to the cemetery. Then it was just as though she disappeared into one of the newly heaped graves. This frightened James, but he knew he must do something. James quickly returned home, got his shovel, and ran to his nearest neighbor's house. He told Lish Hunter what he had seen. "Get your shovel," James said, "and come with me." Lish wondered what had come over his neighbor, James Collins, but he grabbed his shovel, and the two went in the early foggy morning to Old Salem Church Cemetery. There they began to dig into the newly formed grave. Getting down to the casket, they gingerly removed the lid, and there was the woman James had seen 4 mornings in a row at his barn, rigid and cold in death. There was the cup in her hand, and lying on her breast, gurgling but weak, was a beautiful baby girl, still alive, still breathing. Then they removed the baby and covered the grave. They went to John Sexton's house. The door was still barred with the grieving husband and father inside. "Open up," James ordered. "We have a gift for you. Here is little Liza, alive and well." John could not believe his eyes or the story James told him about the baby's rescue. What rejoicing he had as the baby, safe in his arms, began to cry. "Come down to my barn and I'll give you some milk for the baby," James Collins told John, and he did. Never more did James Collins see the woman in a black dress with the tin cup come to his barn begging milk, but you can be assured that he remembered it the rest of his life and told the story again and again. Little Liza grew up to be a beautiful young lady. Her daddy, John, married again and had more children, but Liza always held a special place in his heart because she was the miracle baby, his firstborn, rescued from the grave by his neighbors, James and Lish. "Is that true?" we kids asked Allie and Earl. They only smiled and told us it was time for bed. But every time we climbed the hill to Old Salem Cemetery, we looked at the grave marked with a fieldstone with no names readable on it. We always remembered the story told to us by Allie and Earl and wondered about the mother who loved her baby so much she would return from the grave to get warm milk to keep little Liza alive. And as we milked our own cows early on foggy mornings, we were always aware that if a woman with a cup appeared, we were to fill it promptly with warm milk. I think we were a little disappointed that no woman ever came to our barn for us to do this service of love and mercy. So that's a great story. You can see, I can just imagine a bunch of kids. If I'd heard that story when I was a kid, I've been spooked, but I'd have been really fascinated. And like Ethelene, I would have probably wished that just maybe a woman would have come and asked me for milk, even though that would, of course, meant that there had been a horrible tragedy that happened. But isn't that a fantastic ghost story? That's my favorite of all the ones I've heard. Some common things to think about after people died in those days. One of the first things they would do, probably did for Eliza here in the story, is they would ring the bell. They would ring the local church bell. They would ring it the number of times. The number of times they would ring it is how old the person was. So kind of if you heard the church bell ringing and it only rung one time, you'd know it was a child. If it rung a whole lot of times, maybe you'd know, oh, I know that's probably Old Man Smith, and he's been really sick, and it rung 80 times. He's probably passed away. We expect him to. So that was something common that they did, the tolling of the bell, as they would say. Pap said when he was a boy, he could remember that they still did that they would ring the bell for when people died. That was common even then. Of course, in those days when there was no funeral homes, deceased people like Eliza and little Liza, before she was rescued, they kept them at home. So they would do all those things for them at home. They would clean the body, they would dress them, they would build the casket. In some states today, you can still bury people on your land. I'm not sure which ones or where that's at, but I do know a gentleman that when his uncle died, they buried him on their land, and they built the casket, and they took care of the body, just like in this old, like the old ways. And of course, when he died, they weren't expecting it, so they had to stay up all night. Because there's like, time is of the essence. You've got to get this done. But it was like he looked at it, his whole family did, when things like that happened, because they buried their deceased on their land, as a real love. You were doing that in respect and dedication to someone you loved, so you were willing to stay up all night and make the casket. You were willing to dress the body, to do all those things out of respect for the person that you had great love for. So I can certainly see that. So I'm sure all of you are probably familiar, and if you're not, you can search it on YouTube and find it. But Ray Stevens' funny song about sitting up with the dead. I've never sit up with the dead, but one of my uncles and one of my aunts were laid in state, as they would say, at my Granny Gazzy's home. So I've certainly seen that with the person who's passed away. Instead of being at the funeral home for the viewing, they were in the home. They were in Gazzy's home. So I've seen that, and I'm sure people did sit up with them, but I was not one of them. There's tons of superstitions and sayings about death in Appalachia. So many. It's almost, when I used to write about folklore or something, I'd be like, well, I might as well go and tell you they all end in death, because there's so many of them. But they are interesting to think about and interesting to dwell upon sometimes. So I'm going to read to you a few of the ones that I've heard. So if a bird flies in the house, someone will die. That one's pretty common, so I bet you've heard that one. If a picture falls off the wall, someone will die. I've had a lot of pictures fall off the wall, and I've not had no one in my house at least die. If you hear a screech owl at dusk, someone will die. If you've ever heard a screech owl, they are very eerie, very. They'll make the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up. They're very eerie. This next one is one that seems to be kind of true for me, that I've kind of seen play out over the years, that it seems to always kind of be right, and it's that death comes in three, that 3 people out of the community will die kind of in a short span of time. So for me, that one seems like one that's kind of true. Mirrors must be covered after a death in the house, or whoever looks into one and sees a reflection will die. I've also heard they should be covered because the spirit of the one who passed can't find their way out. Howling dogs in the night signify death. That one's really funny to me because I grew up in a mountain holler full of coon dogs, so I've heard a lot of howling dogs at night. So I don't really, of course, believe that one. If you dream of birth, it signifies death. I think if you dream of death, it signifies birth, but I may be wrong on that. When someone dies, all the clocks in the home must be stopped to prevent another death. And then I've also heard that you should stop the clocks because then the spirit will remain in their house. There's a great song about, and I'll link to it, that Pav and Paul do about a grandfather's clock that stopped when the man died that owned it. So that's a great song. It's bad luck to walk on graves. When I was a child, that was really stressed to us. Not necessarily that it was bad luck so much as it was disrespectful. So if I was in the graveyard, even today, if I'm in a graveyard, I can't make myself step on a grave. I have to walk all the way around the end of it. Just something that was instilled in me when I was young, to be very respectful of the grave. Pregnant women should never look at a corpse or it will mark their child. When I was pregnant with Corey and Katie, Matt's grandmother Laura died. At that point I had been put to bed. It was a rough pregnancy, so I couldn't go to her funeral. But my Granny Gazzy also died, and that was kind of earlier in my pregnancy before I'd been put on bed rest, and I went to her funeral. And when one of my uncles stopped me and told me that, said you shouldn't go and look at Mother because it'll mark the baby. So that one's still alive in some certain parts of Appalachia for sure here. Bees carry the news of death. You've probably heard that one. Bees must be told of their master's death or they will swarm and leave the hives. You've probably heard that. If someone dies and they're a beekeeper, somebody should go tell their bees. Never rock an empty chair because it meant a death in the family. There's one, you've probably heard this one too, if you get kind of a little shiver, kind of the heebie-jeebies or the shiver, you'll say, it's like someone walked over my grave, like you get cold chills all of a sudden when something eerie happens. Horses and mules, and other animals too, but horses and mules can sense death, so they kind of know when it's coming. You're supposed to hold your breath when you go by a graveyard to prevent the spirit from entering you, evil spirit. Never carry an axe or a hoe into the house, it will signify death. That's really bad for us because I probably got 2 or 3 axes in my house right now where Matt leans his tools up behind his chair. Ghosts enjoy hearing people sing and will gather from afar to listen. I just seen that one recently and I couldn't wait to tell the girls. I said, guess what? Ghosts really like singing and they gather from afar to listen. And Corey said, well, I guess we've got a lot of ghosts around here. I said, yeah. If someone sees a ghost, look over their left shoulder and you will be able to see that ghost too. I don't think I'd want to, would you? Never let a swing stop on its own. Stop it yourself or someone you care about will die. Yikes. Graveyards at night are peaceful places to visit if you're quiet, but if you talk, you will be haunted for a week. Don't walk on someone's grave or else you will be haunted by their ghost. Maybe that goes back to the respect thing I was talking about. So interesting and silly kind of, but very interesting bits of folklore that people really lived by. People really lived their lives by them. And maybe I do too to a certain degree. I won't walk on a grave, and I do believe in the 3. It seems like when 3 people die in a community, if someone dies, it seems like 2 other people that's connected somehow soon follow. So lots of interesting things to think about. I hope that you enjoyed hearing my favorite ghost story. I hope you enjoyed those bits of folklore, and please leave any kind of spooky folklore that you know about in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And as always, I hope you'll continue to drop back by and help me celebrate Appalachia.